So this is an official chart series talk, and we have our speaker link.
Well done. Yes. Yeah, so I'm really happy that Dan was able to make it out here. I think we had some informal communications about coming out here and talking about his stuff. But two of the things that I noticed about Nate was when he came into the program at CSU, which is also where I was finishing my degree, he came into a lab that was very much like an action perception kind of lab. So more applied than some people there, but not, not human factors really, although it's very much a human factor. And I kind of looked at him like, I wonder what that lab's going to do, because he was the first student of the new professor, right, along with one other person. And so I was very curious about what that study would lead him to. And then years later, I'm like scanning the journals as I do, and I see an article that's about Tesla autopilots and automation. I'm like, oh, this sounds really cool. Nate, what? And like, it turns out that Nate had been doing this when he was working, I guess, for the Air Force, right? Yeah. So between those two things, and I think our shared interest in military stuff, it's hilarious. I think hopefully there was some influence at CSU, but I have a feeling I think we just gravitated towards modern challenges and problems where humans have to play a big role. So yeah, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here and to hear your talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, thank you all for bringing me. I'm really excited. I was just telling Nancy, I'm a big fan of a lot of the research that I've seen come out of here. As Robert said, came from more of a basic vision background. And so Rob Gray in my work really overlapped a lot. And so I actually met him first at a vision conference we went to a lot. But as Robert said, it was a little bit more focused on the ecological validity in the lab. And so it made it a natural transition when I went and did a postdoc at the Air Force Academy, and we really started diving into human machine teaming, human automation teaming. And that's what took me to Huntsville. I am at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Just to give you kind of an idea of where we are. We're about 45 minutes from the Tennessee border, about an hour and a half south of Nashville, depending on how fast you drive. And Huntsville is a really cool city. One of the things that really attracted me to Huntsville is that it's home to a whole bunch of offerings that are really kind of at the intersect of human factors, including NASA's Marshall Flight Center, U.S. Space and Rocket Center, the biggest space center in the world. Over 300 defense and aerospace contracting companies, second largest research park in the nation, FBI second headquarters, Redstone Arsenal, which is the U.S. Army's center of acquisition. A lot of great outdoor offerings, including cultural things as well, which is all to say, prefacing this, that we're starting up a PhD program, and part of that is going to be hiring a whole bunch of new faculty over the next 5 to 10 years. And so if y'all have great students who are interested in academia, please send them my way. If you have great undergrad students who are looking for good opportunities to get involved in research in a really neat city, please send them my way as well. But that's just kind of the self-promotion side of this. And so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. So I want to start off with, I don't know if y'all know Lex Friedman. He's at MIT now. He's doing a lot of human automation teaming stuff. And he's got a podcast called the Artificial Intelligence Podcast. He brings on a lot of people. And he was interviewing Elon Musk and was talking about this sort of human automation teaming interaction. He said, so I have a bunch of questions about the human psychology and behavior and so on. And Elon interrupts him and says it's moot. It's totally moot. We don't need to worry about this at all because we are right on the precipice of having fully autonomous cars. And so spending any time and resources focusing on the human side of automation is really, in his mind, kind of time and money not well spent. But, this probably doesn't need to be said in this room, but I like to dispel that quickly. So Huntsville is a really nice big city, but I've chosen to live out in the country, and I live way out in the country. And there are a lot of not paved roads, a lot of cattle, a lot of horses on those roads. And when I think about how these autonomous cars are being programmed, how they're being taught, even by companies like Common AI, which is using just your phone to learn these systems, there's just not going to be enough of these edge cases to make an autonomous car, even if all the other technologies were available right now, that functions all the time. And so the human's going to be in the loop for many years to come. I would venture to say that there's not really ever going to be a time where there's not going to be a human somewhat in the loop, at least in my lifetime. And so that gets to the question of focusing on these human automation teamings. And a lot of the research to date has been done in simulators where there aren't real consequences associated with overtrust, miscalibrated trust, and even the performance decrements, right? Poor SA in a simulator doesn't have any negative consequences if you don't see that kid running out in front of the car. But obviously, once we get out into the real world, there are real consequences, real risks associated with it. And this isn't to say that there isn't any necessary benefit for simulator-based studies, but if we're going to focus on a phenomena that's really a real-world issue, we need to start focusing on it in the real world. And a case I always make is that a lot of people play these first-person shooter games like Call of Duty with incredibly high-fidelity graphics, right? Such that the visual experience of playing these games is very similar to the actual visual experience of going to war, but I don't know of any cases where somebody's come home with PTSD from playing Call of Duty, but that risk side of actually deploying and going to war is a real issue to consider in addition to just that visual experience. And so, what we were focusing on at the Air Force Academy is what does it mean for this data when we move into the real world? There's absolutely place for these simulator studies, but when evaluating things like trust, there needs to be real world consequences because the kind of flip side of trust is that we have to have some sort of negative aspect of overtrust or miscalibrated trust. And so thinking about what are these real world consequences and how does the data play out from that? And so we got a Tesla. This was on Air Force Office of Scientific Research. Tesla did not give us this, which was nice. People asked us all the time if Elon actually gave us his Tesla. My initial reaction was I kind of wish he had, but in the long run, I'm glad he didn't because it frees me up to say a lot of bad things about what Tesla's doing. And so, anytime I give these talks, I kind of want to couch it a little bit in saying I'm biased here. I have my own perceptions. I'll try to separate the science from opinion. But we were using this Tesla Model X. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with Tesla itself or the capabilities of these Teslas, they have a variety of automated features, including auto parking, self-driving, adaptive cruise control, a lot of things that these other car companies are doing. But Tesla is kind of widely regarded as the industry leader in these capabilities. And so again, why use this Tesla? So as I've heard kind of echoed throughout today, which is really heartening to hear, we can't just think of these autonomous systems or automated systems as tools, but as teammates, right? It's this synthetic teaming, this teaming between the human and a human-like intelligence potentially down the road. That means we really have to focus on this new relationship between them. This shared control, trust, collaboration, are really representative of that human-machine teaming, such that we can't just focus on in isolation in the lab without any of these real-world consequences. And so obviously, once you take somebody out of the lab simulator, put them in a car, put them in the real world where there are other drivers, there are consequences with running an $80,000 car into other cars. You have kind of this physiological reaction, you have these expectations, and you have these performance detriments that we just noticed anecdotally. And so the one anecdote I love to share is at the beginning when we first got our Tesla, the PI on this project, you may know Vic Fenimore, who's now out of West Virginia, knew that there was this auto parking feature, and so we went to a parking lot so he could try it out. Pulled forward, engaged the auto parking, and then about halfway through the park, slammed on the brakes. Said, okay. It's like, well, it was going to hit the Mercedes. For whatever reason, he picked between a BMW and a Mercedes to park the car. But then he pulled back out, decided to go around again, engaged it, started backing up, and he stopped it again. Like, okay, Vic, you got to let this thing play all the way through. He goes, I don't trust it to actually stop. Pulled out, did it again, same thing, stopped. And so we finally had to convince him to sit on his hands and tuck his feet under the actual chair, which is very ill-advised for a bunch of reasons. But he finally let the car full-on park itself, right? This was the first experience we had of, oh, maybe we're onto something where when it's not just your car that's potentially at risk, not just this research vehicle, but other consequences as well, either bodily harm or financial harm. There are going to be different performances and different responses behaviorally. And so we actually use this auto parking feature for the studies themselves. And so just to give you an idea of how this auto parking works, you identify a spot. The driver has to visually identify where that spot is, and then what they've got to do is hug the cars on the side where the spot is. They drive past it. Once they drive past it, a little P pops up on the dashboard. And that P indicates that the vehicle itself, has identified a certain parking spot and is ready to engage that auto parking feature. The participant then will shift it into reverse and press start, and that engages that auto parking feature. And so they'll then take their hands off the wheel and off the brake, and the car starts to park itself. And it does so in 3 different stages. So it starts backing up. The second stage is then pulling forward, straightening out. And the final stage is going straight back in, right? And so the primary measures of interest were, do they stop the car, right? What is the intervention? This is a behavioral measure. Are they going to actually stop the car? And if they do stop the car, at what point do they stop the car, right? And so Tesla put in this really nice feature for data collection, I'm assuming not intentionally data collection, but it gives you the distance from the objects it's backing up towards. And so it will give it to you in inches, and so we can actually measure how far they are away from whatever those targets they're backing up towards is. And then how does their attention change during their auto parking trials? So we were using Tobii eye tracking glasses, really nice for real world actual data collection. If y'all have any questions about methods or whatever, feel free to interrupt. No qualms with that whatsoever. So let me orient you to the graph here. Every participant got at least 5 trials in this parking setup. And then on the y-axis, we have the proportion of trials by outcome. And so what you see here, this first line, is the auto park engaged. So they were successfully able to engage the auto parking about 90% of the time. So about 10% of the time, something went wrong, right? This is a whole other issue I have with Tesla. It doesn't tell you what's going wrong. It just tells you it's not available. It doesn't tell you you're too far, or you went too fast, or didn't see anything. But about 90% of the time, they were actually able to engage the auto park. What you see here in green is the successful auto park, and in red is the failed auto park. And so those are just the inverse of each other. So when it was engaged, how often were they able to successfully complete the trial? And successful completion was dictated by the car going all the way through the trial, finishing in that parking spot, and indicating that, yep, we're done, we're fully parked. The failed auto park was a combination of the vehicle failing. So sometimes it would just stop in the middle of the trial. So for instance, if somebody came into the lane, the Tesla sometimes decided, no, not going to do it. There were also instances where the Tesla would start not only doing a 3-point turn, but start getting 5 and 7 points, and then it would just give up. And so it would stop in the middle of the trial. But then also driver interventions. And so we break this up by driver interventions and vehicle interventions. And what you see is right off the bat, driver interventions are over 50%, right? So on half the trials on that first trial, participants are stopping the car. They're hitting the brake, they're disengaging that auto park. And one of the remarkable things to note about this data is from just trash cans. We didn't have approval from the IRB yet to have them parked between real cars, and so it was just plastic trash cans, right? And so the actual risk was not that great, and yet there was still this sort of fear of letting it complete. And what you see is about 10% vehicle intervention. So again, another issue with Tesla is that they're not telling you why it's intervening. They're not saying, hey, we stopped because we perceived another car or because that spot seemed to disappear, but it just stops, right? So that breaks it all up. We can also, like I said, look at the distance from those trash cans, those anchors, as a function of those trials in which participants stopped. And so when participants disengaged, every participant that disengaged did so in that first stage, right? The first primary stage where the Tesla was backing up towards that trash can. And so we can plot this here. On that x-axis is just the inches from the anchoring trash can, that first one they were backing up towards. And at about 11 inches from the trash can is where the Tesla stops and pulls itself forward to that second stage. So you're not going to see any interventions below 11 inches because at that point the vehicle is already started forward. And what you see here is some interventions as far as 2.5 feet away, but a lot of them are getting to about this 1 to 1.5 foot distance from the trash can when they're saying, okay, I don't know that the vehicle is actually going to stop. Because again, from a transparency perspective, the car is telling you it sees what's behind it. It's indicating those inches. It's indicating based off of a sensor readout of its ability to detect what's back there, but it doesn't tell you what it's about to do or when it's going to stop. And so you see a clustering there right about at 1 foot to 1.5 foot. But we can also break those interventions up by the 11 participants in this trial. So we had 20 participants, 11 of them who intervened, right? And we've broken it up by their intervention number. And on the y-axis, we have that same distance from the target trash can like we had on the previous slide. And then we've rank ordered them from most interventions to least interventions. So here's the first intervention. You can see that about half the participants were intervening outside of that 1.5 foot. The other half were intervening once we started getting in that really close space. Interestingly, the second intervention was closer, right? And so you're starting to see this buildup of trust amongst the participants. The first time they intervened, if they intervened a second time, they let it get a little closer, but said, I'm still not comfortable. You then had some participants who just really didn't trust the system whatsoever and intervened on every trial that had. And so again, we're given a really nice kind of metric and picture here of what does it look like to build up the trust from a behavioral perspective with these driver interventions. We also collected various individual differences measures. And so what you see here is a regression predicting driver intervention behaviors as a function of risk-taking. So for risk-taking, we use the balloon analog risk task. And that's a task where they have to inflate an imaginary balloon, and they can cash out at any point. As long as the balloon hasn't popped, they can cash out, collect those points. Other times it's used for money. If they go too far, the balloon pops, they lose all the points, all the money. And so it's a measure of risk-taking behaviors. And then also self-confidence, their own belief in their ability to park the car. And what you see is really not any sort of predictive validity from those two measures there. We also wanted to get prediction of self-reported levels of trust in that auto parking feature. And so we had these behavioral measures, but we also asked them to indicate their level of trust in the system as a whole. And so we regressed that self-confidence and risk-taking again, but also the number of self-reported errors that they said the vehicle made. And so this was completely open-ended. We said, did the vehicle make any errors? If they said yes, we said, how many errors did it make? And they would then report a number there. And then number of driver interventions. So this is the number of times they stopped the car itself. Now, interesting thing to me is that this driver intervention here has a negative prediction for that actual self-reported levels of trust. And the reason I think that's interesting is because at this point, when they were reporting their or their trust in the system itself, they had all allowed the car to complete the trial, right? They got to the very end of the trial, and so we're forced to think about maybe this definition of trust as being insufficient, right? And so what we've kind of used as a field is that it's this attitude that an agent will help achieve an individual's goal. But in reality, at this point, all the participants had allowed that Tesla to achieve that end goal, and yet we were still seeing that those with higher interventions early on, even though they learned to not intervene with the system, reported lower levels of trust after the fact. So we have the behavioral data. We also got some eye tracking data. One of the unfortunate things of doing data collection out in the real world, as I'm sure you all know, is that technology doesn't always work on your schedule. And so we had this system corrupt about half of our data. And so what I'm showing you is pretty much just pulled from half of our participants. And so I wouldn't put too much weight in the actual results, but I do want to give you an indication. So the three things we're going to look at is, yeah.
Even above the corruption pattern.
That's a very good question.
Yeah, because if it is, then I'm going to pay more attention to what you show.
I think the corruption was, I think it was of the first half of participants. So in theory, there's no reason to believe that there was any sort of systematic. But with such a small sample size, relatively. But yeah, it was. It's not like it was all those in one condition, or the interveners or not. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question. And so yeah, the three different measures: the gaze patterns. So where were participants looking? Fixation counts. So how many places were they looking when they were making these fixations, and how long they were looking there. So that dwell time. What we have here is a representative heat map of one participant. And so what you see is that they're fixating, spending a lot of time looking up here. And it's hard to see with the way this is kind of grayed out, but that top half of the screen is the backup camera. So what you're seeing is they're paying a lot of attention to that backup camera as they're going back. Interestingly, down here and up here is where you have that sensor information. And so it's giving them the distance, but it's also giving them the fan saying, hey, we see something back there, so it's not just that live visual feed. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute after we talk about the definition of these ROIs, or AOIs, some names. But we define two different regions of interest. That's center display console. So again, up here, they would have that backup camera. Down here, they would have sensor information. And then up here, they would have that sensor information as well. So here we have the fixation counts. And what you can see when we break it up by first park and last park is a similar pattern of data where participants are focusing more on that center display than on the dashboard itself, right? And so they seem to be paying a lot of attention to that backup camera, which, as I'll make an argument in just a minute, seems to suggest that maybe they don't even trust the sensors at this initial step of the process. And so they're relying on their own sort of visual interpretation. And so we have the first park, we have the last park, and then that fixation count. You can see this clear main effect, no interaction effects there, clear main effect such that they're looking a lot more at that center display than they are at the dashboard. When we look at dwell time, we see an interaction, a significant interaction, such that at the first park, they seem to be looking primarily at that center display. So they're relying on that video feed, the cameras. And towards the last park, that relationship has switched such that they're spending less time looking at that center display, that center console, and more time looking at that dashboard. And the information that's being presented on that dashboard is just the information from the sensors. And so the fact that they're spending less on the video feed and more on the dashboard information suggests that they're kind of building this trust in the system as a whole. They're taking the time to learn about the sensor capabilities and now putting more weight into trusting those sensor capabilities, even if they're still monitoring the system. Now they're not relying only on their visual feedback, but also on the sensors themselves. So another thing we noticed kind of by accident at first when we started collecting data is that the instructions we gave the participants mattered a whole bunch in their intervention behavior. So when we got to Tesla came, they gave it to us, they showed us how to open the doors, how to turn it on, and said, have fun. There was no real indication as to how we should actually employ these features, what are some of the limitations of these features. And so we wanted to actually run that as a manipulation. So we had an information and then a demonstration condition. And so in the information condition, the participant got in the car and we told them, here's how you employ the auto park, have at it, right? This is what Tesla did to us. We're gonna do it to the participants. In the demonstration condition, the experimenter would get in the driver's seat and show them how to employ that auto parking and go all the way through an auto parking trial. Right? So as you saw on that first slide, where I was showing you kind of the general methodology, Tesla backs up towards a spot, right? And not many people actually back up towards a spot, right? And so it's giving you a kind of idiosyncratic method of parking that isn't all that familiar to a lot of the participants. And so what we have broken up here is, again, that first park by last park. In red is the information condition. In blue is a demonstration condition. And then we have the successful parking rate plotted on the y-axis. What you see on the first park is those who are given a demonstration of how to park the car tended to let the car go all the way through to completion at a higher rate. Now, you still had an intervention rate. There were still those in that condition who were stopping the vehicle, but they were much more likely to actually let the system go through the actual trial because they knew how it was going to approach, and even maybe had this social facilitation effect where the experimenter was trusting it, and therefore they learned to trust it themselves. But by the time we get to the last part, those in the information condition, we're allowing the system to go through all the way, right? And so this may just be an artifact of the data. The interaction itself wasn't significant. I always hate the term trending towards or approaching significance, but it was close enough that people have asked us to interpret it. I don't think that there's really anything to interpret there. But you see, if nothing else, an equalizing of people's willingness to trust the system and let it go all the way through. But we can break up what happened when things went bad, right? And so just because it wasn't successful doesn't mean that the driver was intervening. And what you see here is on that first park for the information condition, you have about a 50% intervention rate. Only about 10% of those in the demonstration condition were intervening. And then by the time you get to that last park, there's almost no interventions whatsoever in the data. And so the participants are learning over time, but it's not necessarily the case that all forms of information are going to give them the same sort of experience. Now, one point somebody could raise is, okay, this seems a little trivial. Who cares if they're intervening in a parking lot? And I think that's a reasonable question to ask, but then you have to think about the fact that there's really no training when it comes to employing the auto steering, the auto driving features in the Tesla. And I'm guilty of this myself. The first thing I wanted to do is see how it handled out on the highway, right? And so you get it out onto I-25, which is a big north-south corridor in Colorado, and the speed limit's 75 there, right? And so 75 in Colorado means everybody goes at least 80, if not higher. And so now some sort of intervention, if it's not the right sort of intervention, right? If your initial reaction is not to tap the brake, but to slam on the brake or to overcorrect in the steering wheel, now has obviously fatal consequences. And again, we're seeing a 50% intervention rate in a low-risk environment, such that they are stopping the car from just, I don't even know what the right word would be, bumping into a trash can. An interesting aside, we didn't have any participant hit a trash can, and it wasn't until we had the vice superintendent from the Air Force Academy get in the car, the equivalent of the provost at the Air Force Academy, that it finally decided to run into a trash can and scraped up the side. Nice, big. Luckily, he didn't have too many issues with that. So, you can see that we're all thinking the same thing of, okay, this is a really kind of strange thing to be focusing on, this sort of perpendicular parking in a way that seems really inefficient, right? Most people, when we go find a parking spot, just go nose first, so why, in the good Lord's name, would I rely on a vehicle to take exceptionally longer than I would take to perform the same task and not always do it perfectly, right? And so everything we've done so far has utilized that perpendicular feature. So you're going in to a perpendicular spot. But like I said, most people don't back into perpendicular spots. Most people go nose first. And I'm still trying to figure out the best way to incorporate that episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza goes to back into the parallel spot and the guy goes nose first. I have not yet figured out a way to put that into a paper, but rest assured, if I can do that, that'll be more than 10 years to me. So, so most people do feel confident in their ability to perpendicular park, but anecdotally, most people don't feel all that comfortable with parallel parking. In fact, a lot of states have gotten rid of a parallel parking task for their actual driver's test. And so what does it look like here? Well, the perpendicular auto park sequence, this is what I've already shown you before, but they'll drive past a spot, it'll back up, it'll straighten out, and then it will go back in. The parallel parking sequence is almost identical in terms of the number of gear shifts, the number of changes in direction, and the points of that turn, and approaches it much like George Costanza, right? It's going tail first into the spot to straighten out from there. And so first we're going to look at just the efficiency of the system. So this is plotted gear shift, so you can think of this as kind of how many points turn were required to perform the task. We have perpendicular on the left, parallel on the right, the manual in the blue, auto in the orange. And what you see for perpendicular spots is almost nobody even made one gear shift, right? Everybody just went nose first. We didn't count it as a gear shift, that would just continue on with your path. There was one participant who, after a while, wanted to see if they could park like the Tesla, so they could park back in, and so that's what's giving us the single experience of a gear shift. But what you see here is that the system is a lot less efficient than the human, right? For me to decide, okay, I want the Tesla to park itself, I'm now having to forego what winds up being about 45 seconds for the car to park itself, and that's assuming it does it perfectly. In the parallel condition, we have a significant main effect such that it's actually more efficient in terms of gear shifts to use that parallel auto parking. And actually, when you look at time, it's about equal, I mean, statistically equal there, such that there's really no cost associated with using the parallel auto parking feature. And for some participants, it would actually be a substantial benefit because you're not having to do a 70-point turn to get in there. But let alone, you know, we have the efficiency, the temporal efficiency, but we can also look at workload. And so in this case, the workload was assessed for manual of, you know, how taxing was it for you to actually perform this task. For the auto condition, it was how taxing was it for you to supervise the vehicle parking itself. And what you see here is statistically no difference in the perpendicular. It wasn't, in addition to not saving them any time, it's also not saving them any effort, right? And so it's taking longer, it's taking the same amount of effort, so why in the world would I actually use that perpendicular feature? In the parallel condition, what you see is substantially higher self-reported workload in the manual condition than in the auto. And so now, what we're seeing is that the parallel, if anything, is as good in terms of time in gear shifts as parking the vehicle by yourself, but it also seems to be easier, right? So supervising the system itself rather than parking the car yourself seems to confer some sort of benefit. We also did eye tracking measures in here. And so perpendicular here on the left, parallel on the right. And what I really want to draw your attention to is the differences between manual and auto, right? In parallel condition, the gaze patterns were nearly identical, right? They're approaching the task the exact same way when they're supervising it as to when they are doing it themselves. But in the perpendicular manual and auto comparison, you can see a significant difference between their overall gaze patterns, right? And so one of the reasons to additionally believe that people would want to use this parallel is because their experience is of a lower workload, of no time difference associated with it, and their actual phenomenological experience is very similar to parking the car themselves, right? It's the kind of idiosyncratic way with which Tesla decides to do this perpendicular parking that may be leading participants to intervene, but also potentially decide not to actually use the feature. We also find that participants indicated higher trust in parallel than perpendicular auto park, which is really interesting to me because it's the same system, it's the same capabilities, and yet they've decided to ascribe greater trust in the system doing what they seem to be perceiving as harder. The higher trust in the auto parallel than confidence in the self parallel, and so they believe that the car could do it better than they could. And they also had lower self-confidence in their self-parallel parking abilities when compared to their ability to park perpendicular. It's kind of what you would expect, right, based off of your own experience, at least my own experience of I don't really trust myself to parallel park, and if there's any other option, I'm just going to go try to find a perpendicular spot so I don't have to give it a shot. And so, you know, the parallel auto is as fast as humans, and humans tend to trust it more than they do themselves. Whereas the perpendicular auto was much slower than the humans, and they tended to trust it a lot less than they trust themselves. So from that, we would predict that parallel auto features are used more often than these perpendicular features. And so what we did, if any of y'all are subscribers on any self-driving subreddit or Facebook group, I'm sure you saw me spam these groups trying to get actual users. Went out and got over 100 users of self-driving vehicles and asked them how often are they using these different features. And so on the y-axis is the proportion or the percentage of response. On the x-axis was a simple Likert scale for their response. And then we have it broken up for parallel and perpendicular. And what you can see here is a greater overall shift towards never or very rarely using that perpendicular auto park, whereas they're still not using it a ton with the parallel, but you see a lot more participants reporting some or frequent use of that parallel auto parking feature. And this trend between these two sets of data is significant. And so for those that don't use it, we ask them, why don't you use it? In the parallel case, you see this overall distribution. About a quarter of participants are saying they don't need it, right? They can do it themselves. The system is faulty, or I'm better at it. The system's too slow. It's still about half of participants. That's interesting. It'd be really neat to see, okay, if it is actually too slow, or if that's just a perception that they're actually faster, because the data suggests that they're not actually really any faster than the system itself. Whereas in the perpendicular case, the responses for why they didn't use it was, why they didn't use it was not because they didn't need it, but you see this overall shift towards saying the system's faulty or I'm better, right? And that's really borne out by the data, suggests that it's slower, it's imperfect even when it does perform the task itself, and it's not conferring any sort of workload or general performance benefits. So that's the data we collected up until this year when I was at the Air Force Academy. But now I've clearly made the shift. We're still collecting a lot of that data, but I'm no longer there. And so trying to create kind of my own avenues of research here, I've got two separate projects that are kind of building off of this. And so the first is that, you know, we've evaluated the human's perceptions of the vehicle, but I really think this next frontier is going to be for these vehicles to understand the human, right? And so I always make this analogous to if you have a significant other, they don't have to say anything to you, and you're able to pick up on kind of non-verbal interactions to say, hey, you did something that pissed me off, so fix it, right? And so how can we make a system that's able to pick up on those sorts of cues from the actual human user to make it more adaptive? And then the second project is, what is our mental model of these AI systems, right? I'll talk more about this in just a second, but we're at this kind of really interesting frontier where these same companies that are providing these home assistants, like Alexa, are also trying to deliver self-driving cars, right? And they're trying to put these home automated systems into their cars as well. And as we're generalizing trust, what sort of consequences will there be? And so in the vein of helping the car understand you, I want to give you some anecdotal experience of driving the Tesla itself. That wasn't me. But the Tesla's computer vision system is really buggy at this point, right? And so when you're dealing with computer vision, I'm not a computer vision guy, I'm talking to some computer scientists, it really struggles to see red. The problem is red on fire trucks indicates that usually there is some sort of stop traffic ahead. And so you see a handful of these cases where on the highways, Teslas are just slamming into this big metallic object for whatever reason, not seeing it. There were a couple times where I was pushing my trust in the system to see how far I would let the system go. A couple times on I-25, that interstate, traffic was stopped, and I had to slam on the brakes at the last second because it was clear to me that Tesla was not actually going to stop there. There are also really interesting defaults within the Tesla system, such that if it decides it can no longer continue to steer the vehicle, it just hands over control. There's no warning. It doesn't have any sort of safety default. It just straightens out the wheel and hands over control to you as the driver. And so the first time I experienced this was on a curving road near my house. It curved through the intersection. The car lost the lane lines and lost the car in front, and so it straightened out and started going into oncoming traffic. Luckily, I was paying attention. This was early enough on, but again, this created a sort of expectation every time I drove the car. Anytime I was going near a turn, I no longer trusted the system and started getting this sort of apprehensive behavior towards the vehicle itself. And so I began wondering, okay, what if the system could pick up on this, right? This is kind of the same as if you're riding in the passenger seat while your friend's driving and you start to brace and your friend kind of gets annoyed at you, like, we're fine, this is okay, I see it. What if the Tesla could have those same sorts of experiences? And so this is kind of a two-lab collaboration, right? So we're collecting this real-world data from the Air Force Academy using this Tesla, but also, we've got a colleague at the Yale School of Medicine that Robert and I both went to school with, or Vance, who is doing driving simulator research up there. And we're kind of kitchen sinking it with various physiological data, right? Eye tracking, EEG, ECG, GSR, and then also wanting to get into any sort of kind of these behavioral analyses, so shifting in the seat, various indications that you're uncomfortable, your foot hovering over the brake, stuff like that. And then working with computer scientists at the University of Alabama in Huntsville to start building these sort of convolutional networks that will allow us to predict in real time the changes in driving performance. So once the human takes back over control, right, there's a lot of data to suggest that it takes a long time for the human to get back to baseline performance. But then also intervention behavior, right? We want the Tesla to be able to say, dude, we see it, it's okay. I know there's a fire truck up there. We're gonna change lanes here in a minute. Also predicting that trust, right? That trust is a correlate of those intervention behaviors. And then also things like attention, right? We don't want to be handing back control if somebody is playing a Nintendo Switch. You see all of these cases on YouTube of people who have learned how to hack the system by putting like an orange in the steering wheel, so the steering wheel gets some sort of haptic feedback that the driver has his hands on the wheel, even if he or she does not. And so, not wanting the default to be, hey, here's control of this car barreling down the highway, if the actual driver's not ready to pick it up. So obviously, we want to be able to predict these driver states if we're going to have this sort of seamless human-machine teaming, this seamless interaction. If you think about what makes a good team in human-to-human teams, it's rarely the case that you have one person just acting however they want to and just throwing you whatever data they decide they want to throw you. It is this sort of communication and back and forth. Also allowing for this idea of kind of adaptive transparency. And so, what is the amount of information I can give you in this moment where we have this sort of baseline trust, but as I violate your trust, I need to be giving you more feedback about what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and allowing for this kind of greater enhancement of the overall teaming. And so communication that's not just reactive, but is also predictive. I heard, what was the term this morning? Yes, anticipatory pushing. I like that a lot. Yeah, this whole idea of, can I anticipate what information you're going to need either to perform a task, but also to feel confident that the car is going to perform as it should. And then obviously once we get outside of just these sort of consumer vehicles, getting out to drone interactions. There's been a lot of talk about special operations forces having sort of autonomous drones to go out and search buildings. And so how can I start to anticipate what that sort of feedback is that we want? So on top of that, gets this idea of mental models, right? Is the Siri in my phone the same Siri as is in my computer or your phone? Right? So when we talk to our parents on the phone, we still know it's our parents. We're just interacting with them through a different modality, but we don't have that great of an understanding of how do we kind of perceive these cloud-based intelligences. When I'm interacting with Siri on my phone, is my expectation that it's the same kind of intelligence, it's the same, for lack of a better term, person that I'm interacting with when I'm interacting with her in my computer. Why does that matter? Well, we tend to generalize trust, right? So if I trust Siri to tell me how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon, once I now have Siri in the self-driving car that Apple's developing, I may have this kind of baseline over trust of the system that leads to this sort of consequences of miscalibration. And so how are we doing this? Well, going back to my early days of just basic vision research, one of the nice things about these sorts of visual search tasks is they have really predictive data, really predictive outputs, such that as you increase the data set, you have a linear increase in the overall time it takes to find. For example, a blue L in a grid of L's and T's. But also, we know the difference in the discrepancy between target absent and target present responses. And so once I give you this sort of AI assistant to help with the task, what happens when I now shift something about that AI system? I change the voice, I change the name, I change the behaviors, I change the appearance. We can think about circumstances wherein maybe the same computational abilities of these assistants can be transferred, but maybe now instead of Siri, we want to have Sam in the car, right? So we give the perception that these are two different actual intelligent entities, so I can learn to calibrate my trust to Sam in the car and Siri outside the vehicle. So, again, this is, I think, preaching to the choir, but we're a long way from autonomous vehicles. Despite what Elon says, every year, I think the running count now is 3 years in a row. He said by the end of next year, we're going to have fully autonomous vehicles. We're not anywhere near it. I realize he's got stock to help and a vehicle to push out consumers. But we are a long way from not needing to consider the human driver. And for people like me that actually enjoy driving, we need to be considerate of the fact that people are going to want to have at least the option to drive, especially when you live in the backwoods like I do, and the risk of deer coming in front of your car is not necessarily the abnormal event, but more the predictable normal event. And so to promote this safety and performance moving forward, we need to get that data collection into the real world. So not just in these simulators. The simulators have their place, but we need to consider what are the real world consequences. Understand the human perception of the vehicle, but also help the vehicle understand the human teammate as well, so it can adapt as it needs to. And then understand the consequences of this kind of new frontier of cloud-based intelligence, right? So for the first time in our evolution, intelligence is not inherent to an individual. It's inherent to however you're interacting with this intelligence, right? And so different embodiments of the same intelligence, and you see this depicted in Hollywood all the time with movies like I Am Mother, right? This understanding that these are just subcomponents of a greater overall intelligence. And so if you want more, we've got a few publications out already, more in the pipeline coming our way. These are some of the folks I've been working with. Ewart Visser, who's at George Mason, but is also helping at the Air Force Academy. Colonel Chad Tossell at the Air Force Academy. Benitha Menon as a computer scientist at UH. I'm working with Art Bands is at Yale School of Medicine, helping with the simulator data collection. And then my master's student, Jake Davis. Yeah. So, if y'all have any questions. I realized I talked really fast there, but I had a lot of stuff. I'm excited.
Well, it's more of a comment than a question, because you kind of focused when you originally said with treating it like a tool, you can ignore it. It's attitude. wrap up there with adaptive to passive much of this, but even when it comes completely autonomous, it would be foolish to ignore that you have a passenger might freak out or just not enjoy the ride or whatever.
That's really great insight. I frankly hadn't even thought of that, even just from a user experience perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to, because you said tool in mind, I thought was very phenomenal. It's like if I have a hammer that's spiky bits on the handle, I'm not going to use it.
Yeah.
No matter how cool the Tesla is and how efficient Tesla is, it's constantly going 60 miles an hour into a parking and stopping immediately. It's like I haven't died yet, but I want to do this again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great insight. Yeah, of just, providing that reassurance the same way you do your friend. I could stay shutting up, but I want them to ride in the car with me. So yeah, that's really great. Yeah, and clearly I think Elon's in the minority of that. I think I think
that's more to do with stock than anything else.
I think you're right.
Even within that, I think Elon's
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some comments too. So we know that communication is the key, coordination is the key in terms of interacting with people, and this kind of sticking point to developing or designing on the systems, autonomous systems. The one question is that it's not only interaction what we are looking at, between human and technology, but also we are looking at interaction between human, technology, and the environment. What I noticed that last time, when I took Uber, by the way, I don't know how to drive a car.
Really?
I just learned what is a perpendicular parking. so I learned there are different type of parking anyway. So, but the thing is here, it's kind of fascinating that the sensors around that Tesla car, it's recognizing where it's boarding or approaching the car. So I just wondering, can you obtain that data, that coordination data from that, it's kind of public PC type interface?
Yeah. So when we first got the Tesla, Vic, who was a PI again on the grant, was working with Tesla to try to get back-end access to it, so we could pull that data. Predictably, Tesla was apprehensive about handing over back-end access. And truth be told, we never pushed the issue. That being said, I think that would be fascinating. And you do see some of these companies, was it Waymo, who released terabytes and terabytes of data from their self-driving vehicles, so you can do that. I think also Comma AI, which is run by this guy, George Hotz, has made everything completely open source. And so they're relying just purely on the computer vision and sort of sensors. And so I think, moving forward, getting that data is going to be a lot easier. But unfortunately, we don't have any data, despite the fact I think it would be amazing to have that. It would paint a lot better picture, I think, than just inches from whatever that obstacle is.
Yeah, because we know that mental models are, yes, important model technique, but we know that also it's beyond that. It's an evolving process, those interactions, and also the cognition, right? Since we are looking at tool as a teammate.
Yeah.
So they're looking at metrics and measures in a dynamic way rather than more static. It's going to bring great insights on this task.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did get a telemetry system to try to allow us to bypass sort of the not having back-end access. We didn't get it set up while I was there. I don't know if they made any headway in getting it set up. But yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I think we would be a little dunderheaded to not leverage as much data out of this as we can.
Because I was thinking that, especially when you get that coordination, it coordinates, right? Then you can look at a environmental disorder and order, how it's related with the overall system and how it's related with trust.
Yeah, well, and I think that's also interesting if you can get at, okay, what are the environmental predictors in addition to the Tesla, the system itself, that are predicting these sort of intervention behaviors? having a motorcycle in your blind spot, at least for me, it's going to make me a lot more apprehensive about completely trusting the system. So I think you're right. I mean, if we can get kind of this greater picture, I think it allows us to understand that communication aspect of that. It's a great idea. You should help us get the telemetry system set up and then pass off all this data here. And, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Mhm.
It just reminded me of this talk I was having with the gentleman when I was in Boston. He brought up this interesting point that one of like the end goals of developing autonomous vehicles to be able to help out people. And the sort of scenario that he proposes, like suppose you're on your way to work but you're running late and now you can't find a parking spot. If you're fidgeting in your car, the car can pick up on the movements. The car asks you, like, are you okay? You respond, no, I'm running late, I can't find a parking spot. The car can then say, why don't you go inside, I'll find a parking spot for you.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, if people are having trouble with trusting the car to park, they're not going to be able to trust it to find a parking spot, to drive around in the parking lot and find a parking spot. So do you think if designers of these autonomous vehicles implemented some sort of feedback system so that when the driver is in the car, and then they start worrying, like, hey, are you going to hit this car here? And the car's like, no, my sensors indicate that we're this far away, we can still keep going, everything's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really great idea. I think there are two sides. One, I want to have the ability to essentially ask the car what's going on, have an idea of what's going on, but also, like you and I talked about earlier, having that car not wait to be probed for it, but to say, you know, dude, you seem really fidgety. You have an extra cup of coffee, or do you not trust me today?
Yeah.
I think provides a real benefit. And so I think having sort of that driver monitoring, it doesn't even have to be the sort of physiological data. You know, there are various labs, and Lex again up at MIT is doing some of this just visual detection of behavior. And so I think the sort of non-invasive ways are really, at least from my perspective, the way to go moving forward. And so, yeah, whether it's fidgeting, whether it's some other behavioral or communication indicator that the human needs the car to accept more responsibility in the situation. I think Tesla has unveiled, I don't know if they're calling it something special, they probably are, but where now you can just get out and tell the car to go find a parking spot.
I saw a commercial for smart car, I don't know if that was Tesla.
That may have been, yeah.
It was accurate.
I think there are a couple companies that are offering these. But yeah, I mean, one of the issues there is my development of trust in the system is contingent on it coming back without any dings or scrapes or anything, right? So I don't actually know how well it's performing the test. I just know that it came back like it should.
Just drove around the block for 5 hours.
Yeah, exactly. It takes itself out for a joyride. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple approaches of this. Tesla's approach seems to be, what are all the bells and whistles I can give you? Whereas, I would like to see more of kind of what you're talking about, of this back and forth, verbal or nonverbal communication of the system understanding the user, to be able to say, much in the same way that a significant other would, I know you're running late. Here, you run inside. I'll go park and I'll meet you inside. No, the car's not going to meet you inside, but hopefully not.
Well, it's on your phone.
Exactly. Well, and as much as I talk bad about Tesla, I'm waiting for it to become sentient and then track me down and drive me off the cliff. But,
that exact thing is like what the last Mission Impossible movie. I don't want to get the spoilers away. Yeah, a remote control vehicle through his phone that like runs people over or whatever he needs to do.
Terrifying, terror potential as well, right? So it's easy to think about how these things could help, but putting technology in the car that intelligently goes where you ask it to go is like a nice 6,000-pound missile you can send wherever you want.
yeah.
Well, in a consumer's hand for no qualms and like no instruction from the person selling it to you.
Yeah, I mean, from you know, a cybersecurity perspective, there are all sorts of videos of pen testers taking over control of even non-smart cars, right? I mean, Jeeps, Honda, Civics. I mean, it's, so yeah, and I can't remember the author. There was some author that put out a series of books about kind of this dystopian future, and one of the premises was everybody had these smart cars, and all it took was hacking one of these smart cars and killing somebody to make everything grind to a halt, because now nobody wants to actually get in their car and go anywhere. Commerce shuts down, you start starving and like that. Now it's a little extreme, but
Well, it wouldn't even take a malicious act is what makes it scary. You know, the software updates on Tesla, that was one of Mike's points in Chicane and sort of in her papers too, is that they push an update, you were like on your way to work, you're like, yeah, I'll update, whatever, But like, first of all, who knows if it's a valid update? Supposedly they're doing certification checks and blah, blah, blah. What I know is,
of course,
Windows gets this wrong often enough that I don't trust any system ever.
yeah.
So I expect to break everything about that vehicle.
Well,
And they'll know after, you know, a couple hundred people die that day and they suffer a huge stock tank that like, whoops. But then people have funerals and be in the ground again, and then the next time the patch update comes, you know, they'll be like, well, we don't find a better way of doing it. It takes
Yeah.
blood.
And the issue, I mean, is in Tesla's owner manual, they say you void the warranty if you don't update the system.
Legal.
Yeah, yeah, excuse me, legal. And so if I own a $50,000 car, I'm not going to say no because I don't want to pay out of pocket when the battery explodes. So yeah, it's great. Yeah.
So going back to what raises one more about, you know, like, oh, like all the where you go ahead and stuff. I wonder if trust is affected whether the driver's in the car or outside of it. Because I have a friend who's been to Tesla, and he would use a function where it would literally, he'd be standing on the sidewalk, and he'd call his car to come pick him
The
up.
summons feature. Yeah.
Yeah. But when he gets in the car, he won't touch the autopilot at all. And it's because he's like, well, I'm not in the car when it's coming to me. Well, when I get in it, I don't have the control. So I wonder how trust is contingent on whether the driver is actually sitting in the car versus when they're outside.
Yeah, that was actually my exact question when you brought up the all-time parking spot. Is I'm more willing to trust if I'm not in the car.
Yeah.
I mean, the original comment was, I don't trust it because I'm next to a Mercedes as opposed to a trash can.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, y'all are picking up on something important here, and it gets back to the whole kind of philosophy associated and the ethics associated with self-driving cars, even the trolley problem of how does it decide where to go. But yeah, I mean, selfishly, I think we all have that sort of instinct of, you know, I don't want it to run over anybody, but if it's not running over me, at least that's better, sort of. And so, you know, I think when I was at the Air Force Academy, we had a distinguished visitor, I'm not sure the name, but was a competitor of Elon, and it came up that he had a Tesla, and this question essentially came up of, we were telling him about all this stuff, and we asked him, you know, how often are you using these features? And he said, never. Well, really, I mean, this is a big tech company. This is trying to offer competition to Tesla. And he said, yeah, I don't trust Elon's judgment on a lot of these things. Like completely deadpan, very serious about it. And so I think once we raise the stakes by putting ourselves in the car, I think you're exactly right. We can even look at gradations within that. If I'm driving on the interstate, that's one thing. If it's just a parking lot rather, that's a whole other thing. You know, if it's just a financial cost associated with damage, okay. If it's me potentially dying, less okay. Yeah.
Does Elon have a Tesla?
You know, that's a very good question. I don't know.
I think he slid himself into space the first time. That's what I think happened. I think he made a robot of himself and then left.
You know, that would be the best indication that you shouldn't buy a Tesla.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this all the time with big tech giants of them saying they're not going to give their kids an iPad, or okay, well then why should I give my kid an iPad? That's what, now I want to know.
Well, how often does he drive himself?
That's a good point. Well, even if he does have a Tesla, does he ever use the auto driving features? Yeah.
I'm sure he can say it's kind of like you plead the fifth on that one.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
It's my company.
He's already been in violation of the SEC, so why do it again?
So that's another question.
Yeah.
I think the first one, actually, can you go back to, I think it was the first, maybe one of the first graphs that you showed? This nice graph, like the first and second and third intermissions kind of thing. I'm just gonna ask you to follow up. Yeah, this one.
Oh, this one?
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, we built up. So these are only the people that interviewed.
Yes.
So there was a decent group of people who never interviewed.
So we had 20 participants, so 45% that never interviewed.
So yeah, like to Elon's point, and this is another question I have for you. I do get that from an engineer standpoint, if I build a system and test the system and believe that it works, all of these people are idiots.
Yeah.
Right? Because like, but what he's neglecting is the fact that he's built up the experience, his engineers have built up the experience, just the way these people are. And like a nice sort of bridge connection to him even is to say, look, like people aren't that stupid. It only took them 3 times to figure out that they didn't need to touch this thing.
Exactly.
But like it took them 3 times, and that's the part that you're ignoring. And 3 times can mean a lot. Like,
Yeah.
Like you said on the highway, right? So, and then there are always, because people are crazy, there's always the person that, intervenes 80,000 times, the person that develops a new habit, or the person that flies down the interstate doing 120 asleep in their car.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I don't think he's taking responsibility for that, but I don't think he wants to do it. Anyway, I just point out that it's an interesting bridge. It also means that of these people, like 9 of the 11, it only took twice, and maybe even less, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
That's a 1 trial learning, and that's tough.
Absolutely.
It's tough to get 1 trial learning. So do you think that's because it's real?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there are a couple factors at play, and I think we lost a lot of potentially interesting data by not doing, not videoing participants in the early studies we started doing it. I think first and foremost, so this was all with cadets at the academy, over half of whom are going to become pilots. So it may be a more risk-seeking group, and so I don't know if you would have a similar pattern.
Also more electronically trusting group.
Yeah.
Flight tools.
Yeah, I would absolutely think so.
And probably thinking, well, if our professor's asking us to do this, how dangerous could it be?
Yeah.
I know about IRB, right? Like we teach all our students about IRB. They know that there's nothing we can do to.
There's no trash cans.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I really don't know what's the motivator for them letting it go that second time. We tried to refrain from giving them any sort of feedback, but I suspect that there was still a component of them seeing that the researcher wasn't nervous, right, sitting in the passenger seat, not concerned about the car.
Sure.
So that may be playing a part. I think it also may be the fact that there is, it pulls forward at 11 inches, but it starts slowing down a little bit before that. And so once you start getting to this threshold of, 1.5 feet away, you can start to feel the car slow down. And so that may be an effect.
Yeah. And actually, if you look,
that's
this is support for that, right? The people who are above the 20-inch mark are doing it twice, although person 6 is surviving.
Yeah.
That's an interesting observation.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a lot more to be borne out in this data that we don't have the ability to answer yet, but I think you're onto something of, what information were they picking up on that they decided, yeah, sure, let's see it go again this time. Or maybe it just wasn't so novel the second time and started backing up towards something they knew was at least establishing a pattern.
Yeah. Which I think that reliability thing is what gets people right.
Yeah.
You trust the thing to work every time, and then you go around and turn and it doesn't.
Yeah.
And how many times did you trust it going straight before you hit that turn? To the point where you're not even thinking about, it maybe won't work on the turn. You're like, it's worked the last time.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and not to keep going back to anecdotal data, but driving this car, one of the reasons I developed less trust in the system is it would start to identify parking spots that were clearly not parking spots. Like not even close to parking spots. Like there were a couple times it wanted to park in between the guard station and the barrier at the Air Force Academy, and there's not enough spot for a motorcycle in there. And so you start to pick up on these, okay, what interpretations is it making And so one of the other things we want to do is give people the vehicle for a long period of time and see how that kind of evolves.
Yeah, I mean, I really respect Micah for doing her sort of anecdotal version of that. She's
Yeah, I
trying
think
to
that
be
was
really
awesome.
objective about it. But at the same time, like, we really do know too much. Like,
Yeah.
she's spent her whole career thinking about these things, and so she's gonna be hyper aware.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a great paper. I think it was, a neat way to kind of jumpstart this focus on it. But yeah, I think you're right.
It's
We all
not
have,
grabby, right? Like, hey,
Of course.
I spent 6 months with a Tesla. Here's what happened.
and it's Mike Ansley, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
anything she writes, I'm going to read. So.
If that had been me,
Exactly. Who's this assistant professor that wants
right? Who cares? But, which makes sense. So, my other question was about the risk aspect, because I agree with you. In fact, I don't remember if you were part of the very much bar-infused sorts of debates we would have about these trust issues with John Blitch, but we managed to get him out here as he was doing his crazy life last semester, and he was talking a lot about the fact that the risk-taking aspect that should increase or manipulate these trust variables isn't often done, in part because of IRB, right? So we have these sort of ethical reasons why we can't really give people dangerous situations to deal with, but from his perspective, having been in special forces and seeing the real world, that missing factor means a lot. And I think you're going to run into the same problem, even though you want to do realistic stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think of a way we could get out of it. And I think you're close because you've got people who own these things willing to like start telling you stuff. But yeah, it just seems like such a huge problem. I just wondered what else you thought about that. Like, how do we get the risk-taking part back in?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on a point of
So hard.
I like to sell it as if there's risk, but there's clearly not that much risk.
You're in the car thing too. Like, there's some of that.
Exactly. Well, this actually came up in meetings with the IRB. One of the members of the IRB, as we were, we finally got approval. Now we have approval to take them out on the open road, things like that. And the IRB member said, "Sounds like you want them to roll the car." And my response was, "I'm in the car too. I don't want them to roll it." So, right. So I even have this sort of implicit understanding that there's not a whole bunch of risk because I'm accepting that risk by sitting in that vehicle. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's multifaceted. I think the risk needs to clearly be mitigated for ethical reasons. But that doesn't mean that the perception of risk has to be accurately calibrated with the actual risk.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think, I mean, you raised a really good point of, I don't know where the right line is. And I tend to agree with Blitch. I mean, Blitch and I had a lot of these same conversations of, if we're going to try to extrapolate this to the warfighter, we have to have some sort of stress or risk component. But yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely open for ideas you have as to how to mitigate or how to enhance these risks without posing essentially undue risk on the participants that would be impossible to get past the IRB.
The closest thing I can think of is that they did, insurance companies are very invested in understanding the kinds of behaviors that people have on the roads. They do on-road driving studies all the time. Yet I have not seen, but undoubtedly, like Liberty Mutual or somebody who's doing this, and they're using more autonomous vehicles. And it could be, though, that they're restricted in sort of allowing for what is essentially illegal stuff. So you take your Tesla out on the road and allow it to be in autonomous mode, and you don't monitor it, which is what some people might do if you videotape from the car, right? Then like there could be consequences for that the insurance company is not allowing for, so they don't even want to. It's like don't ask, don't tell. Like don't show me that you were asleep, man. Like I can't, I don't see that. That's not happening.
Exactly.
But even then, like to me, that's the closest you can get. It's like you've got real people driving their own vehicles, so if nothing else, the financial risk of totaling your car or crashing into somebody, but then you've also got them living in the seat. But people are terrible anyway. Like look at teenage drivers take crazy risk. And
Well, I know the risk of texting and driving, and I still catch myself doing it.
Really?
Don't listen if insurance company are listening.
yeah.
I mean, I think you're absolutely onto something, and you see this with like Neville Stanton's work, right? I mean, so the complacency almost immediately in some of these participants where they're just willing to engage in some sort of secondary task. But yeah, I mean, one of the other things, and I think kind of on par with what you're saying is, I want to access some of these open source data sets, but I'll also reach out to these companies and see if they will give anonymized data that allow us to kind of replot the environment and behavior without getting any sort of this back-end stuff. Because I think that really is, I think, going to be the most ecologically valid, and where there is actual risk that we're not manipulating, but we can capitalize off of.
I haven't seen this yet, but you'll hear it from me first, then it's not out there already. I think, similar to the kinds of regulations that people are calling for, I don't know if I want it all regulated, but I want that data regulated in output. In other words, I want to be able to do exactly what you're saying because it's a federally mandated, regulated data source that is maintained at the peril of the company that I can access. Because we've seen already, this came up when John Lee was here, that when like Tesla releases one of these reports, one of the recent reports they released is like this nice little touchy-feely infographic, and someone on the internet's like, that's wrong, and sure enough, they were like smoothing over a whole bunch of errors and calling things other things because they have a different kind of skin in the game. You know, it's clear that they can talk about safety to promote the sales, but not, you know, actually get into the nitty-gritty, especially when people are making mistakes. So there's going to have to be some accountability measure, because this is one case for sure I don't think companies are going to own up to it. At least not the ones that are around now. Like maybe some market forces will change that.
You lead that charge, man. I'm right behind you.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'll
we have
support
a mission here to be public good, and I feel like that's very much in it. Arizona's known as a state that likes autonomous vehicle stuff, and every time I'm on my bike and I see one of those Waymo cars, I think the hell out of its way. Because, and which is terrible, probably. It's probably needs more cyclists than its training data set. And I'm like robbing it of its.
But it doesn't need me. Yeah.
But it doesn't hit me, so you know I win.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a little bit more time. So anyone else being sparked with ideas? Let's see.
Having flashbacks to grad school here.
Oh, probably.
You sitting up in the front.
Yeah, like, so when you talk about the, you know, your parallel parking condition, because I think that's interesting. I really like the idea, because for sure, if my car could parallel park, I almost don't care if it hits other people. That's so terrible, parallel parking, I'm happy to admit it. And living in California did not make me better, it made me worse, made me get like anxious. Because there's so many people that when you go to park, you've always got someone waiting behind you, of course, which I think is another interesting little manipulation you could do on this, right? That's a really good point. Some panic. The social pressure, yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. And the perpendicular one would be just awful, which is why I was laughing when you're talking about the car like pulling in front and then backing and doing like a 3-point turn. I was like, no.
And there were a couple of times where people would be waiting for our participants to finish that part, and the participants were very uncomfortable, like, sorry.
Well, that's good.
Like, should I stop? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so in this case, like, did you plot, I can't remember if you plotted the number of interventions for the parallel thing again, right? That's the next graph.
And so this was workload. So the data itself here, we did not counterbalance the order. And so I wasn't the PI on this data, so I don't remember what the explanation was for not counterbalancing. Yeah, well.
It happens.
Yeah, and so my recollection was that actually were almost no interventions in the parallel data. But, you know, that also could be driven. Actually, you know what? No, I think what it was is the parallel condition came first and then perpendicular. And I don't think that there were really any interventions in there, again, because I think it was approaching the task the same as with participants.
I was going to say, this feels a lot like just familiarity, like you said. We know parallel, we know when it's wrong, but what?
Yes, exactly.
The thing I noticed is recently my son got his driver's license and they introduced that pull back, pull through, and I'd originally done it as a pull back kind of thing, so that's the most logical way to do it. They seem to be forcing us backing up. It's parking that I'm like, somebody does it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these.
Really, is it true?
You're not allowed to pull backwards in.
Yeah.
But I think that's just because they can't read your license.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, I guess I was just curious about number of interventions, just because it seems like you could almost explain this as sort of a maybe a complacency type of argument, especially because you see the attention shifts which is sort of a hallmark of that, right?
Yeah,
The hallmark of complacency is eyes off, hands off, just like, whatever, it doesn't matter what I do anymore.
exactly. Well, and that's one of the things we wanted to get with this eye tracking. The problem that we should have foreseen, but we didn't see, there are obvious luminance differences outside of the car and inside. And so when participants looked outside, the camera took a while to resolve. And so we lost that data. So we can't actually, I mean, we can get things at the very bottom here, but if they start just kind of looking around, taking out the scenery, we lost that data because it couldn't resolve that. But yeah, I mean, I think that's additionally interesting if you can get a little bit more because I mean, just because obviously looking at it doesn't mean they're actually paying attention, and I mean, it can just be fascination with what's going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, and like it's always hard to get it high enough resolution down to the AOIs where you can say they're looking at data that actually informs them versus in general this whole blob over here.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, I haven't got to. It's going to have to deal with that in my own simulation soon. But yeah, it is very difficult. I'm impressed with the use of the eye tracking glasses because I think the glasses are the future, and so everyone who's using them, I'm just constantly drilling them about how's it going and how's the data.
Yeah, Anthony Rees, who is at ARL, was the one who was doing a lot of the actual eye tracking analyses. And so if you're interested, I have to put you in contact.
Oh
He's
yeah,
kind of a
we
guru
might reach out to him.
on that.
I have a whole separate conversation I'll prime you for later when we have some time about eye tracking and trust.
Yes.
So anyway, yeah.
I love it.
I think that's an awful lot of it.
I love it, man.
Anyone else have more stuff?
I have a report that Elon Musk does drive Tesla
Oh, all right.
with his kids.
With his kids. That's all right. I think he's a robot. He doesn't have much emotion or
Like I said,
time.
I think he built a robot of himself and launched a real one into space.
He lost the real. He's just sitting in that astronaut suit. I love it. That's great. Well, that's heartening a little bit, I guess. Trust the system enough.
Yeah, the problem is if it kills him, it's still the same problem. It won't have been solved, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think this is fundamentally what differentiates me from, I think, John Lee in some ways. Because it seemed like he was willing to sort of play ball with his companies. That's fine. Like, he can have his opinion like that. Mine is like, yeah, every time Tesla uses their data set and kills somebody, I think they should be held super duper, responsible for that. And yeah, just because the person was careless and fell asleep is no excuse for them to be let out of that range.
Well, you see it being litigated now.
I know, yeah. And people, the Uber case is another one of these examples, right? And that person wasn't even a real user. They were there to monitor it, and they had that. And then you got someone else's pedestrian death too. This is only going to happen more, and it's going to take a certain amount of swell before either the companies abandon the concept, which would be economically damaging in a way that like all the deaths really aren't.
Yeah.
Or they're going to continue to fight cover it all up and act like it's the user's error, which only promulgates that culture that people in human fact have spent the last 30 years trying to combat. And it's going to spread into all the other domains after the autonomous cars are made and these people are off to other jobs in aviation, process control, or nuclear power plant. Whatever it is, it's not good. And they need to learn that lesson before that happens.
Well, I think there's also kind of this, for lack of a better differentiation, city versus country divide, right? And so a lot of these companies are stationed in these big cities where there's a lot of input all the time for these cars to rely on pretty predictable traffic patterns in that, at least in like LA, the traffic sucks and you're not going fast anywhere. But I mean, once you get out into these areas, rural Alabama has a lot of really terrible roads, right? I mean, so now you no longer have the visual input. You don't have a predictable sort of haptic input for the vehicle itself as it's traversing this. And so, I mean, if we're going to see fully autonomous cars, I could see it being in a city environment. But once you get out into the country, I don't think you're looking at much feasible offerings.
Well, they're going to alienate the market, right?
Yeah.
So just like they did with the original versions of like hybrid electric cars, there's a certain market that's just like that wouldn't even get me to work.
Exactly.
much less to work and back.
Exactly.
So there's gonna have to be.
It's a fun time to do this research for that reason.
Yeah, no, this I think it's super interesting stuff and right on time, right?